Hello, linguists. Welcome back to Hell. This is one of my favorite parts of the underworld of Hell, because today we get to talk about Chaucer, poet of the New Middle English. Chaucer, as I will tell you, is my guy. He's the author that I've chosen to read most about, and he's the subject of most of my research. So I'm especially going to enjoy introducing you to my favorite poet. But first, let's talk a little bit about Middle English. Spelling first. Now, I know you just tensed up because you heard the word spelling and you thought, oh, there are all these new rules coming. In fact, it's rather the opposite. You've already learned the rules for Old English. What's happening in Middle English is basically those Old English rules that seemed so foreign, were so difficult to memorize, they're being transformed into what is familiar. So really, this is a transitional period. Middle English is a transitional period in which the grammar of Old English is going away, in which the spelling rules of Old English are going away, and all of that is being turned into what you're familiar with. So Old English had the SC, which you memorized said sh, like in the word sheop or shop. That's being replaced by the digraph, sh. Oh, digraph, di to graph to write. In other words, a sound written by two letters, represented by two letters. Sh is a digraph. So SC is turning into the much more familiar sh for sh. Similarly, our runes, eth and thorn for th and th, are being replaced by t and h, another digraph. And of course, all this is not happening, on Christmas Day of 1066. This is happening for several centuries. You'll see thorns and eths and ths. And it happens over many centuries at different paces in different places. A transitional period. We had to learn that rule for C. In Old English, it usually made k around a back vowel, but fronted by a front vowel, it was fronted to cha. And instead of just C making the cha sound like in child, C-I-L-D for child, in Middle English, that's becoming C-H-I-L-D. See? Familiar. Nothing to it. Similarly, non-initial H, you learned, makes h sound, which is still being made in Middle English, but it's being written with a G and an H. So the word night, instead of being K-N-I-H-T, is now K-N-I-G-H-T, but it's still pronounced, as in Monty Python, Knecht. Later, that sound will go away, but the GH is still there to represent the H that was there in Old English, even though we no longer go cha in the middle of the word. We also have some new letters. Don't worry, these are familiar too. We're getting the letter V or the letter U. That's the same letter. Originally, that was just two different ways of forming the same letter. It had two values, but it was originally the same. So a double U, if you look at how it's written, it's really written as a double V. That's because U and V used to be the same letter. If you recall your rules for Old English F, when it could be voiced when surrounded by voice sounds to a V, and so instead of F making that sound like heovon, H-E-O-F-O-N, heovon reaches weird, that's being replaced by a V, which could be written as a U, just a rounded bottom V. We also get Y, which is really just a variant of I. And if you recall the rule for G, usually makes a back g in Old English, but it could also make a front ya near ea. So for that front ya version of G, you're getting ya, the letter Y, which could be written I. So in other words, a gradual shift to modern English spelling. Just a couple notes on pronunciation before we get to our Chaucerizing. The vowels are still IPA symbols. So I is E, E is A, so E, A, A, O, U, European vowels, singing vowels. One difference is the final E, the schwa, could sometimes be silent. And how do we know that? Tape recordings. Nope, nope, nope. Poetic meter. As we'll see in a moment, when the Normans came over and they packed all of those French words in their luggage, in their take-on bags, they also packed iambic pentameter and meter. And so poetry, instead of having the Old English alliterative half lines, we start doing iambic pentameter and other kinds of meter. That's one thing you really should remember. Old English doesn't have syllabic meter. It has alliterative stress. And what we think of as poetic meter, that's Middle English. And to make the line work, ta-dum, 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 we can just tell that sometimes, oh, that E, that has to be silent. So we know from that evidence, to make poetic lines, add up in terms of syllables, that sometimes final E was pronounced and sometimes final E was unpronounced, and a poet had a choice of a pronounced final E or a silent final E, and presumably the reader would know which one to go with. I refer there to the GVS, the Great Vowel Shift. We'll get to that a bit later. You notice that in English we're doing E, A, A, O, U, or A, A, E, O, U rather, instead of A, E, I, O, U, which we have today. Well, that shift to the modern English vowels is called the Great Vowel Shift. It's coming after Chaucer's life, basically between Chaucer and Shakespeare, 1400 to 1600. That's coming later. Has not happened yet, so keep using your European vowels. There are still no silent letters, except, as I mentioned, the final E, schwa, could be omitted. Runes are slowly being replaced by thorns. I mentioned that on the last slide, I guess. In the Chaucer excerpt we're going to look at in a moment, notice that Chaucer writes that and hath and bathed with THs, and not with eds or with thorns. Another word about Middle English pronunciation. Different scholars disagree on exactly the extent of this. We can't know for sure, but it's probably likely that these French loanwords pouring in, which you learned to identify in the last lecture, were pronounced, there's no better way to say this, Frenchly. So Chaucer uses the word, it looks like liquor, flour, and courage. There's a good chance it was more like liqueur, fleur, and courage. We won't worry too much about that. In fact, we're not going to be too specific about a lot of things, including a word on Middle English grammar. We spent a good time talking about Old English grammar. Boy, I wore you out with inflections, didn't I? You probably feel pretty inflected still. Declensions on verbs and on nouns, conjugations on verbs rather, and declensions on nouns, and case endings and verb number endings. And so you're probably again tensing up thinking, oh no, here comes the whole system of Middle English grammar. Well, the word I want to give you on Middle English grammar is nah. Basically all you need to know is all that stuff you learned in Old English, it's slowly going away because we don't have it today. And it's going away at different rates in different places and with different things sort of transitionally. We're just not going to worry about it, except for one fun detail I'll give you next time. And his Canterbury Tales. So to just orient your literature to your linguistics, Beowulf, the great epic in Old English, which began with the Anglo-Saxon invasion 449, a Germanic language. Middle English, the language of Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales, began again with an invasion from the continent, 1066, the Norman French. English is now a Germanic and Italic or French language, a hybrid language. So the texts people have heard of is, oh, you studied Old English, that's Shakespeare, right? Nope, nope. Shakespeare is modern English. Beowulf is Old English. Chaucer, Middle English. I'll tell you in a moment why I call him the poet of the new Middle English. But first, I thought I would take a picture of what I'm looking at this very instant. I just took that picture a second ago, so it's accurate. Chaucer's my guy. He's the subject of my graduate studies. He's the one I wrote my dissertation on. I've published 5-6 articles on Chaucer, mostly on the Manciple's Tale. I'm betting you have not read your Manciple's Tale unless you're like an uber English major. It's a lesser known Canterbury tale, not familiar like the Knight's Tale, the Miller's Tale, the Summoner's Tale, the Reeve's Tale, the Nun's Priest's Tale. You might know these. They get anthologized. My goal was, I really loved Chaucer, and in graduate school you've got to pick something to focus on. And I knew if I picked, say, the Miller's Tale, I could spend 5 lifetimes reading everything that had been published on the Miller's Tale. And I would never get to the end of knowing what had already been said, you know what I'm saying, to know what would be new. So I thought, there's this minor tale, a short tale, with only about 50 articles on it. Really, that's not very much when you're, spending 5 years getting a PhD. And so I thought, I can read everything that's ever been written about the Manciple's Tale. And so that's what I did. I've kind of found a small corner in a very popular street, or a lesser known tale by a very famous author. So people have heard of Chaucer, but not the Manciple's Tale. And I think to this day I've published more articles on the Manciple's Tale than anyone else. And so when journals, peer review journals, get submissions and they're about the Manciple's Tale, they will often forward them to me to give them a reading, an editorial opinion. Is this new? Is this interesting? And I get to do that from time to time. So all of the books you're looking at on the shelf are on Chaucer. There is a vast literature on Chaucer. Thousands of books, in fact, have been written explaining historically, philosophically, linguistically, literarily, all that he's doing. And I only have a small fraction of them, but every book over there is about Chaucer, pretty much. Hey, and there's my OED up on the top. On the right, you have a bottle of Chaucer's mead, empty. On the left is something completely unrelated to this course. It is asparagus wine from Germany. And if you were in my German class, I would tell you the story of that bottle. So Chaucer had a plan to write a huge volume. The Canterbury Tales was going to be much, much longer, and it's a frame narrative, you probably know. It has 26 of the tales got written before he died. It's one of the great unfinished works. There were going to be 120 tales, but the sort of central concept is different characters from a cross-section of medieval England, from a peasant to a preacher, to a knight, to a monk, to a merchant, to a reeve, is like an estate manager. They all tell tales, to a miller, a bawdy miller, and we get a little introduction to the character, a little portrait of the character, and then the character tells his or her tale. And each tale, it not only tells a different story, it creates a different world. And each world has its own world view. So the Knight's Tale is filled with knightly visions of aristocratic behavior, of courtly love. It's the world from a knight's perspective. And the Miller's Tale is full of bodies and orifices and stuff coming in and out of orifices, like hot pokers. And it's full of blasphemic sort of references, and its humor depends on the kinds of things a miller would have found funny. So it's a wonderful bit of sort of sociology, a portrait of medieval England from several perspectives. Wish we had the whole thing, but incomplete as it is, we still read it as the central text of Middle English. Chaucer is the first major author to use English after 1066, and he lived in the 14th century. He's probably writing the Canterbury Tales in the 1380s, 1390s. So it has been 300 years since William the Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings. During those 300 years, I mean, we're talking a third of a millennium, folks, the literature produced in England was in French, in Norman French. And yes, there was English being written, but the first major author, the first author that anyone's heard of to write in English is Chaucer. And he made a revolutionary break, because we have his school work. We have some records of what he wrote in as when he was young. It's in French and Latin. He did his schooling in French. He probably would have spoken French when he sort of apprenticed or lived with a noble family in England. He would have been speaking French. And so he decided that even though French and Latin are the established languages, that English, which used to be just a peasant language, has taken on a new richness. It's that tens of thousands of French words, has developed English to the point where a great and lasting work of literature can be put out in English. He also must have the confidence that the language will not be forgotten and lost because it was written in a minor dialect of a unimportant, non-prestige language. So he chose English, and it's partly because he chose English that more authors followed him. If he hadn't chosen English, it would be less likely that we would have authors picking... It's less likely we'd have English literature for the next couple hundred years following Chaucer. That's why he's sometimes called the father of English literature. The language he uses is now rich. It is much richer, broader and deeper than the language that the Beowulf poet had, or the Seafarer poet. It has Old English and French words. So Chaucer can pick among different registers, right, to characterize different authors. It's also rich in that, yes, now we have two French forms, rhyme, end rhyme, and iambic pentameter, or meter, but we still have alliteration. And as you'll see in a moment when we walk through the first 18 lines, one sentence, that Chaucer uses both. In fact, he's a bring it on, it's all good kind of author like Shakespeare. He's not a filterer. He's an omnivore. All forms of language are good. The more words, the better. The more forms of expression, the richer what you can say becomes. So he uses Old English and French words, French rhyme, French iambic pentameter, and Old English alliteration. He's so different from a modern person who might say, I'm only going to write in the standard, correct, official version of the language and not use any bad grammar or non-standard English. He even uses words pulled from different dialects of Middle English. And there were many, many dialects and subdialects. And if he wanted one for its sound or its rhyme, he'd use it. Because the Middle Ages had not a sort of policing view of language, but an all-encompassing, a receptive, an inclusive view of language. Chaucer is also significant because, unlike the Seafarer, which you would have gotten nowhere without a translation, and Beowulf, which cannot be read without studying it as a foreign language, he's the first author we can read with only footnotes. You can read Chaucer off the page and get most of what he's saying. This, by the way, is not true for all Middle English writers. It ain't even true for all Middle English writers in the 14th century. Check it out. Chaucer is writing London Middle English. And there are dialects all over the south, going all the way up to the Northumbrian. If I were to give you something from the north of England at the same time, you almost couldn't make out what it said, just the occasional word. But out of all of these different dialects, one of them became the prestige dialect, London Middle English. Why? That's where the crown was. That's where the king or queen was. It's where the center of commerce and wealth was. So that when printing starts in a couple hundred years, and that language begins to that form of language begins to colonize the rest of English, which form is it that becomes the ancestor of modern English? What form is our language directly derived from? His Middle English. So it's really fortunate that Chaucer lived in London and was a clerk and attached to the court and to the palace, that he's writing in the version of Middle English which became modern English. I'm going to present to you the first sentence. It's an incredible opening gesture of what's called the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales, telling how the different pilgrims and the narrator gathered in the Tabard Inn. And the first 18 lines are one sentence. And I'm going to suggest to you that this one sentence, if you hear all of its linguistic complexity, contains the entire history of the English language. So here's hell in one sentence. And you do have a literature question coming about that for homework. So as we read, be thinking about the question of why people go on pilgrimage. I shouldn't just say why. I should say the reasons, plural, why people go on pilgrimage. So listen to everything in this sentence, and then when we get "Van longen folk to go on pilgrimage," then people long to go on pilgrimage, ask yourself, based on what I've just read or heard, what is their motivation? We have sota to rhyme with rota. So he grabs that Middle English form from that dialect. On the next page, do you see why he goes to sweta? That's right. Assonance. He wants the vowel sound to match up with breath. With and ache. Ache with his, and Zephyrus. Oh, four of them, goodness. When Zephyrus, ache with his sweta, breath. So he's like, whatever different forms you got, it's cool. Is one of them misspelled? He would say, what do you mean misspelled? He wouldn't even know what that means. Those are just two ways the words are said, two forms of the word, and they fit his poetic purposes differently in different lines. So what has Zephyrus the west wind done? Inspired hath in every holt and heath the tendre or tendre croppes. It is inspired in every holt and heath, in every forest and field, the tender crops. So this idea that the winds are breathing life. Inspired, spire is a breathing word. So to aspire, respiration, to expire is to die. To inspire is to breathe into. Think like Genesis and God and breath and spirit. It's that idea, like God breathed life into Adam in the Bible in Genesis. The west wind is breathing life into the plants, into the forests and the fields. I said we're in rhyme and meter. That doesn't mean, though, that we've left Old English alliteration completely by the wayside, does it? Where has it been inspiring? In every holt and heath. You hear the echoes of Cadman there, right? You hear the echoes of Seafarer. Chaucer is still using Old English poetic form, along with French. So it's inspired the tender crops. And the younge sonna, the young sun, that's astrological. The sun passes through different astrological signs of the zodiac, and it's still young, meaning it's early in its progress through the ram part of the heavens. We don't think in those terms, but that's an astrological way of saying it's mid-April. And I'm recording this in a time when mid-April's not too far away. So what's the young sun done? The new sun, the younge sonna, hath in the ram his halve course I ronna, has run halfway through the zodiacal sign of the ram. I've underlined 3 vowels there, O's, which you might have noticed I pronounced as U's. junge Sonne and die Rönne. I'm not going to tell you why yet. I will tell you why later. What else is going on? Now, if this is all sort of a camera, the camera starts with sort of April and the showers falling down and the wind inspiring life and the flowers and the woods and the meadows. Now we move down to birds. Now the camera's focused in on birds. And smale, you do have to have the to make the rhythm work, right? And smale voeles maken melodie. And small birds are making melody. Don't you love that sound in spring? And then this curious line that makes no sense. Birds that slapen al the nicht. Notice nicht with open eye. Yes, that's eye. Melodie and eye. What do you mean they're sleeping all night with open eyes? Well, if you're asleep, your eyes aren't open. That has got to be a bit of a joke, that they're not really sleeping. They've got one or maybe both eyes open. If you look out your window in mid-April, what are the birds doing? What are they looking for? They're looking to make more birds, right? I think this is a bit of a sexy talk about the birds and the bees, that they're sleeping all night with one eye open. And why are they doing that? So pricketh him natuur in her courages. They're doing that because they feel this urge that nature is pricking them. And if you think you hear a pun in that, you do. Pricketh him, nature's pricking them where? In their courage, in their heart. And that courage is French, and it reminds us of one of those Grimm's laws. Cor, or cœur in French, is heart. So a cardiologist is a heartiologist. Courage is heart. So nature is giving them this urge to reproduce. And that's why that's why they sing, right? Mating calls. And they're sleeping all night with their eyes open. So that's what's going on in nature. You might almost forget that we are leading up to a story about human beings making a pilgrimage to a martyr's shrine. But that's where we're headed. In fact, we're getting closer and closer. Because the rhyme for thus pricketh him natuur in her courages, thus nature pricks them in their courages, we then get sort of the thesis statement. Then longen folk to go on pilgrimages. Wow, suddenly we've switched to people. So that's what nature does in spring. This is what people do in spring. People long to go on pilgrimages. And that's a French word, pèlerinage, pilgrimage, with the j sound. Picture the three symbol, j, which is always French. There's no Old English j. So wait, pilgrimages. The idea is you would go to a holy place. Medieval Christianity has holy places. Often they're associated with martyrs. Often there's a relic of the martyr. If you've been to Europe, you've probably seen relics, which are the bones of martyrs, holy charged objects. And there are accounts of people going to different pilgrimage sites. There were tons of them throughout England. Rome is a major one. Jerusalem is the biggest one. There are accounts of healing miracles, that the bones of the dead saints, which people would revere, not worship, but revere, would perform there. So people go on pilgrimages. And you're kind of wondering, well, if that's what nature's doing, why are people going on pilgrimages? Pilgrimages are, in addition to a religious journey, it could be given to you as penance. You've committed a sin, and the priest says, say, 3 Hail Marys and 4 Our Fathers, and go on pilgrimage to Canterbury. Could be a religious journey. Could be a journey of personal piety. It could also be that most people in the Middle Ages didn't get 5 miles or so beyond their farm. They didn't have mass transit, a way to travel cheaply. There were no holiday inns, no euros where the money stayed the same. But a pilgrimage was a kind of sanctioned way to leave your farm, your life, your burg, and to travel. Well, continuing on, folk long to go on pilgrimages, and palmeris for to saken straunges strondes, to ferna halwes cuth in sundry londes. So there's a species of pilgrim called a palmer. And a palmer is sort of like a professional pilgrim or a habitual pilgrim. Whenever you'd go on pilgrimage, you would get a little souvenir. Whole markets would pop up of these kind of souvenirs. Just like if you go to, my daughter went to London and Paris, and you almost can't come away without a snow globe with an Eiffel Tower in it, or an Eiffel Tower keychain, something kitschy like that. Same thing in the Middle Ages. So you'd go to a pilgrimage site, and you'd bring back a little, sticker for your laptop or luggage bag saying, hey, I've been here or there. And if you went all the way to Jerusalem, you got a palm branch. Think about Jesus's entry into Jerusalem and Palm Sunday. That's the symbol of, hey, I got all the way to Jerusalem. So you have that on your MacBook Air in the Middle Ages. And so they're called palmers. People who, I also have an aunt on my wife's side who loves to go on cruises. I think she's been on a couple hundred. She's the Palmer of cruise ships. That's Arnold Palmer, by the way, the golf star, in case you don't know. Help you remember Palmer. So it almost brings the motive into suspicion. Why do you keep traveling around the world on these? Are you just that devout? Or is it something else motivating you to go? Because they don't just want to go to the local pilgrimage site. They want to go to Straunge Strondes, strange strands, strange shores. Notice another alliteration. To Ferna, that's far. Halwes, that's hallowed. Like hallowed be thy name, or All Hallows Eve, Halloween. To faraway hallowed places. Cuth, remember Cuth is known and uncouth is unknown. Cuth in sundry londes. Sounds a little bit like world traveling, doesn't it? And compared to all of those places that people like to go, and especially from every shire's end, and especially from every shire's end, imagine hobbits leaving the shire all over the place, from every shire's end of England to Canterbury they wend. And to make the line work in iambic pentameter, you've got to go of England to Canterbury they wend, like that. So Canterbury is a favorite destination for people from all the different shires of England. And why are they going? We end with a final couplet, our opening sentence. The holy, blissful martyr for to sake. They're going to see the holy, blessed martyr. That's Thomas à Becket. He was an archbishop of Canterbury, and he got into a spat over power with his old friend Henry II, King Henry II, in the 1100s. And Henry II said to a couple of thugs around him something to the effect of, boy, I sure wish that Thomas à Becket would, fall into a hole and never be seen again, in a way that's not exactly an order, but that the people around him basically knew what he was talking about. And we assume that when Thomas à Becket was murdered in his cathedral, yeah, I've been in it, maybe you have, Canterbury Cathedral, he was murdered there, that it was probably the king taking him out. It was a hit. But what do you do when you hit religious people? You turn them into martyrs. And that began right away when they were preparing the body of the murdered Thomas à Becket for burial. They took off his sumptuous exterior linens, the robes that the archbishop would wear, and underneath he had a hair shirt. A hair shirt is exactly what it sounds like. Medieval piety often involved punishing your body, keeping the sins of the flesh intact by scourging the body. You can picture the Monty Python, monks who sing Pie Jesu Domine and then smack themselves in the forehead with the book they're reading. He was wearing a hair shirt, and it had so rubbed his skin raw that there were maggots in the flesh which had died on his body underneath these beautiful, gold and satin robes that he was wearing. And people said, "Oh, what a holy man." And so did King Henry win? Not at all. He created a martyr so that 300 years later, 200 years later at least, and after that, people are still seeking the holy martyr of Canterbury. T.S. Eliot wrote a whole play called Murder in the Cathedral. Maybe you've read it. So why are they seeking Thomas? Just to say hi? No. That's the martyr that him hath holpen, one that they were sake. People in the Middle Ages believed in miracles, holy places, holy objects could create miracles. Their books attesting that someone took a little vial of sand that someone told them that Jesus's feet had walked in, and you still see Jesus's footprint 2,000 years later. Never mind whether that's a reasonable thing to exist, or some of the dirt that Thomas à Becket actually walked on, and that they gave it to their sick, heifer, and the heifer no longer had liver cancer, or stopped delivering monstrous births, cows with, genetic deformities. People believed in that kind of tangible Christianity with miracles. So why are they seeking Thomas? Because him hath holpen, that him is them. He hath holpen them. Holpen is on its way to being helped. We say have helped, they say have holpen. In other words, it had a different vowel change past, like sing, sang, sung, instead of a weak past like help, helped. It was still strong and was on its way to becoming weak. And it had helped them when they were seka. In other words, miracles. So wait, are they there because they just want a quick fix? Or are they there because they want to express their thankfulness, to pray to God and thank him for the healing that he has accomplished in them, they believe, through the miracles of St. Thomas à Becket? Chaucer is slippery. He's ambiguous. He leaves things unclear. That's why he's a great author. He doesn't give you answers. He raises interesting questions. Oh, I forgot the very last word. Notice that Chaucer rhymes seca and seca. Sick and seek. Sick and seek, which sound different today, but sounded the same then. This sounds to us like a little bit of a cop-out, or a little bit of a silliness. In fact, this was a grand flourish in the French tradition. They called it rime riche, the rich rhyme, where you rhyme together two homophones, two words that sound the same, but have different meaning. And that's why he ends on a great French flourish of seca and seca. But what else does he do in that final couplet? Him hath holpen. He also nods back to the Old English tradition of alliteration. If you've not read the Canterbury Tales, it's a must-read. It's on everyone's top list of books. And now you have a little better insight into why Chaucer is not just a great storyteller. Even if he had written mediocre tales, he would still be super important as the poet who was the first writer to use the new hybrid Middle English.
Wandered up with the shore of Soda, the hooked of March, persecuted, but everything switched the cool, there too, and generated the plural. Spirit there with his break of bread, spirit hot in their bread, hold your hair, the tender corpus and the younger son, hot in the ramata because they run. Sal fool is back in the melody, slipping over Nick with Near, do in the air, Rogers, you know what to go on. People Rogers, a strength, a storm, to bend, not hold, a good and something, not a thing, a pitch, your leave, for every ship is at the other angle on. The whole left means for not about to say, to get that open, oh, what it is, say.
I think that guy actually made the second callback for Hamilton. Just barely missed making it into the cast. But Chaucer, everyone.